What if a quiet, autistic man, the one everyone overlooked, was the only person brave enough to stand up for a single mother about to lose everything? This is the story of how silence turned into courage, and how two lives on the edge collided in a way no one saw coming. Stay until the end, because what he reveals will make you look differently at every neighbor, every struggle, and every unseen act of kindness around you. The morning light was pale and merciless, the kind that doesn't warm, it only exposes. Emily stood before her apartment door, her breath caught halfway between disbelief and panic. The paper fluttered slightly in the wind, bright orange against the chipped blue paint. Notice of eviction, it read in bold, official letters that screamed louder than any voice ever could. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, tracing the edges like it might disappear if she touched it gently enough. But it didn't. It stayed there, just as real and cruel as the silence pressing against her chest. Behind the window across the hall, Daniel watched. His posture was careful, almost frozen, a notebook clutched tightly in his hands. He had been writing again. He always did, when the noise outside became too sharp, too unpredictable. His eyes followed Emily, not out of curiosity, but recognition. He knew that look, the fragile stillness of someone holding back collapse. The world could be too loud for him, but moments like this, he felt its cruelty too clearly to hide. Emily turned slowly, staring down the quiet hallway. Every sound, the hum of a refrigerator, a dripping faucet somewhere nearby, felt too loud, too close. She swallowed hard, the paper crumpling in her hand, as if it could absorb her regret. "What am I going to do now?" she whispered. But the words, thin and trembling, dissolved before they could reach anyone who might answer. She looked at her son's closed bedroom door. He was still asleep, thankfully. The thought of waking him to tell him they might lose their home made her chest tighten. Not again. Not this time. She promised herself she'd never let it get this far. Promises, it turns out, don't pay rent. Outside, wind pushed the clouds lower. Daniel pressed his palm flat against the glass, his breathing shallow. He didn't move because he didn't know how to fix what he was feeling. He understood systems, patterns, and rules, but not this. Not the silent kind of suffering that didn't fit neatly in a notebook. Still, something in him stirred. A quiet insistence. The smallest thought. Maybe silence could speak, too. Emily stepped outside, scanning the parking lot, as if someone from the rental office might appear, willing to talk, to listen. But the lot was empty except for a single cracked shopping cart abandoned near the dumpster. That mundane image hit her harder than she expected. It felt like a reflection, something discarded and forgotten. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, whispering again to no one, "How did I end up here?" Some part of her wanted to tear the notice down, throw it away, and pretend it never came. Another part just froze. She looked down the office number printed in block letters at the bottom of the notice. It felt like a threat disguised as help. She folded the paper carefully, almost reverently, and slid it into her pocket as if she were hiding evidence of a crime she didn't mean to commit. Through his window, Daniel turned a page in his notebook. His writing was small and neat, lines forming patterns that only made sense to him. But beneath today's date, he just drew shapes, circles, then lines connecting them, until it looked like a network of thoughts. As he drew, his hand shook slightly, and one word began to take form in uneven print. Help. He stared at it, then crossed it out. He wasn't sure who he meant to help. Emily sat down on the top step, elbows on her knees, hands covering her face. The cold from the concrete seeped through her jeans, grounding her in its indifference. She wanted to scream at someone, the landlord, the system, life itself. But there was no one here to hear it, only the faint scratching sound of a pencil from somewhere behind her curtain. Daniel had started writing again. The air between their apartments held an invisible thread, taut and fragile. She didn't know he was watching. He didn't know he would soon change her life. But something wordless passed between them, an unspoken recognition that both had spent too long invisible. And maybe, just maybe, Neither of them wanted to stay that way anymore. That evening, the orange paper still hung on the door, now damp from the mist that rolled in with nightfall. Streetlights flickered to life, and for a moment the glow reflected against the notice, turning it from orange to a deep blood-red hue. Daniel saw it from his window and felt his heartbeat echo louder than before. The sight triggered something. A memory, a sound, something buried deep. But he couldn't name it yet. He just knew it hurt. When Emily finally stood up, her breath came heavy and uneven. She looked back at the paper one last time before retreating inside. In the dark hallway, Daniel's notebook closed abruptly, pages snapping like a secret. The sound startled him, but not enough to make him move. Instead, he whispered something, a single sentence. So quiet, it almost didn't exist. But if someone were listening, really listening, they might have caught it. This isn't how it ends. Later, when the entire building had quieted and the faint hum of televisions faded behind thin walls, Daniel remained by his window, the notebook unopened beside him. He thought about patterns, how every story had one. But sometimes, he realized, someone had to break it for the story to change. And as that thought formed, he found himself staring once more at Emily's door, now shadowed and still. A single drop of rain slid down the glass, catching the faint reflection of the eviction notice. Daniel blinked slowly, exhaling through his nose. His fingers flexed nervously against the edge of the notebook, and though no one would ever see it, his expression softened. There was something he needed to do, but even he didn't yet understand what it was. In that silence, a single thought refused to fade. Perhaps this wasn't just Emily's story. It was his, too. He just didn't know why yet. What would you do if silence was the only voice left to speak for someone else? Tell me below in the comments. The next morning, sunlight slid cautiously through the blinds, too gentle for a day already broken. Emily moved around the small apartment like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. Boxes she'd saved from old deliveries were stacked on the table, half filled with clothes, books, and small things that once made the space feel like home. Now, each object seemed to mock her, mute reminders of promises that stability once whispered and never kept. Her son still slept, his breathing steady, unaware that their world was about to change again. Through the thin walls came muffled voices, the kind heavy with unfamiliar laughter. The neighbors. They always noticed. And once they noticed, they always talked. Emily's chest tightened as she heard her name wrapped in sentences she wasn't meant to hear. Such a shame, one voice said. Poor choices, another replied. It wasn't cruelty that hurt the most. It was the ease with which empathy turned into judgment. On the other side of the wall, Daniel sat with his back to it, his notebook open across his knees. Every word they said reached him too, but differently. For him, it wasn't gossip. It was static, noise that carried weight it shouldn't. He tapped his pencil against the page, over and over, each sound a heartbeat he couldn't control. He didn't like words being used like blades. He'd seen it before, lived it before. Emily knelt to tape a box shut and paused when she noticed her hands shaking. Her mind traveled to fleeting thoughts of calling someone, anyone, for help. But the only names she could think of were people she hadn't spoken to in years. Sometimes silence isn't absence, she thought. Sometimes it's a mirror. A knock at the door might have saved her then. But none came. Daniel stood eventually, pacing his small room. He wanted to do something, to say something. But the idea of stepping into the hallway, of facing eyes that always looked too long and understood too little, felt unbearable. So, he wrote instead. A sentence so simple it almost shamed him. You're not alone. He stared at those 3 words, uncertain whether they were brave or foolish. Then his breathing slowed. He tore the page out carefully, folding it once, twice, like a fragile secret. For a long time he just held it, the paper growing soft from the warmth of his palm. When the hallway finally went quiet and the world outside his door turned still enough for courage, Daniel opened his door just wide enough to slide the note underneath hers. Emily didn't notice it at first. Hours passed. The sound of packing tape, cardboard, and shallow breaths filled the air. Then the note caught a draft, drifting forward and brushing against her foot. She almost stepped on it before bending down, frowning. When she unfolded the small piece of paper, her face changed. 3 words, written in uneven handwriting, letters pressed deep into the paper. She read them again, slower this time, trying to believe them. "You're not alone." The sentence sank into her in a way she didn't expect. Not comfort, exactly. Something quieter, like recognition. She stood there for a long moment, eyes drawn to the door across the hall. Daniel's door. Maybe. Probably. She didn't know what to do. Thank him? Pretend she hadn't seen it? The walls between them felt thinner than ever, and that frightened her more than being alone. Daniel sat back on his bed, counting the seconds after he released the note. 1, 2, 3. Time seemed to hang, suspended in nerves. Then, faintly, footsteps. He looked toward her door but didn't open his. His chest hurt in that aching way that comes from both relief and fear. He pressed his palm against the cool plaster of his wall, as if he could feel her there through it. Emily read those 3 words again before setting the note gently on the table. Something about the handwriting made it impossible to throw away. She wasn't sure if it was hope she felt, or the faint terror that someone noticed her pain too closely. Sometimes, kindness can be as frightening as cruelty when you've forgotten how to trust it. In the evening, the whispers downstairs grew louder. One neighbor's voice floated up through the stairwell, laughing softly, cruelly. This time, Daniel heard it too. He stood by his door, fists tightening, caught between his fear of confrontation and the instinct to protect. His lips moved without sound, rehearsing words he would never say aloud. The voices eventually faded, but their echo stayed sharp inside him. Emily turned off the lights and sat in the dark, her son now asleep beside her. The glow from a single street lamp spilled across the note still lying on the table, its edges curling like something alive. She looked at it one last time before closing her eyes, whispering, "Why now?" But deep down she already knew this wasn't random. It was connection, reaching through silence. Across the narrow hallway, Daniel opened his notebook again. On the same page where the message once rested, he wrote a single sentence beneath the empty tear mark. "Some things begin in silence." His pencil paused mid-stroke, as if waiting for permission to continue. But none came. Only the steady hum of a building that had no idea a small act had already begun to alter its story. And as he stared at his desk, Daniel's hand hesitated before it started sketching again, unconsciously drawing 2 doors facing each other, a thin slip of paper resting between them. He didn't yet understand why that drawing unsettled him so deeply. Maybe because it looked unfinished, like there was still something about to happen between those doors. What do you think Daniel truly meant with that note? Tell me below in the comments. The note stayed on Emily's table for 3 days. She didn't move it, didn't throw it away. It became like a presence in the apartment, quiet but persistent. A small white square that seemed to watch her as she folded laundry, checked overdue bills, and tried to smile for her son. Every time her eyes landed on those words, "You're not alone," something deep inside her stirred, fighting against the numbness she'd worn for too long. On the morning of the 4th day, she found herself standing in front of Daniel's door, heart pounding, as if she were about to do something dangerous. She hesitated before knocking. The hallway was silent, except for the faint ticking of the old radiator. Her mind filled the quiet with doubt. What if he didn't want to talk? What if it wasn't even him who left the note? But something deeper pushed her hand forward. A soft knock. Once, then again. For a moment, nothing. Then a faint shuffling sound, and the door opened a few inches. Daniel stood there, his expression uncertain, eyes darting to the floor instead of her face. "I found your note," Emily said gently. Her voice tried to sound casual, but she wasn't fooling either of them. Daniel blinked, shoulders tensing, then nodded once. That tiny movement held more meaning than a dozen words could. He opened the door wider, gesturing awkwardly toward the inside. "Tea?" he asked after a long pause, the word strained through hesitation, but sincere. His apartment was neat, almost too neat. Everything arranged with methodical precision, from the lined-up mugs on the counter to the blinds perfectly parallel. Emily noticed the smell of mint tea already in the air, faint and comforting. She sat at the small round table while Daniel moved quietly, his hands trembling slightly as he poured 2 cups. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind that lets the world breathe for a moment. They talked, though talked might have been too generous a word. They took turns filling the air, Emily speaking carefully, Daniel answering with short sentences, always truthful, always thinking before each word left his mouth. The pauses between them became part of the rhythm. Every silence said what language couldn't manage. That was when Emily realized how much noise she had lived with, judgment, pity, unwanted advice, and how different this felt. This was peace. At one point, Daniel's eyes drifted toward an old photograph on his shelf. A woman smiling beside a garden overgrown with wildflowers. Emily followed his gaze, curiosity softening her features. "Your mother?" she asked. His fingers tightened around his mug, knuckles white. He nodded. "She used to help people," he said. The words came slow, deliberate. Families who were losing their homes. There was something raw in his tone, a tenderness wrapped carefully around grief. Emily didn't know what to say. All she could manage was a gentle, "She sounds kind." Daniel looked at her then. Really looked. "She was," he said quietly. She believed no one should face the end alone. The echo of those last words lingered in the small kitchen, and Emily realized for the first time that his note hadn't been a gesture of pity. It was a memory taking shape again. As the hours bent toward evening, the tea cooled between them, but neither moved to leave. They didn't talk about the eviction, or her boxes, or the whispers in the hall. Instead, they spoke about small things. Her son's fascination with stars, Daniel's drawings, the way autumn light made everything look softer before it died. Sometimes, the spaces between their words carried more feeling than speech could hold. And slowly, something fragile took root between them. Emily's shoulders began to drop for the first time in weeks. Daniel noticed quietly, like an observer cataloging a small but miraculous event. He didn't say anything, but his eyes softened. When she laughed once, an unexpected, surprised sound, his entire posture seemed to pause, as if afraid to break the moment. It was the kind of laughter that reminded both of them what being human felt like before the world turned heavy. Before leaving, Emily placed her empty cup in the sink and turned to him with a shy smile. "Thank you," she said, voice low but steady, "for the tea and the note." Daniel looked down at the floor, fumbling with a dish towel, unsure how to respond. The corner of his mouth shifted, almost a smile. "It helps me too," he said. His words were small, but the truth behind them was vast. As she stepped into the hall, a soft drizzle had started outside. The sound of rain against the windows blurred her thoughts into something slow and tender. For a moment, Emily lingered, tempted to say more. But she didn't. Daniel stood at his door, watching the rain streak the glass, his expression unreadable. He whispered something she couldn't quite hear before closing it quietly behind him. Back in his apartment, Daniel opened his notebook again. The page from that night's drawing was new. Not the eviction notice anymore, but a scene of 2 teacups on the table, steam rising between them like invisible conversation. Underneath, he wrote a single line: "Silence is the first language of trust." His pen stopped halfway through the word trust, as though uncertain it belonged there yet. Emily returned home to find her son still awake, his small voice asking, "Are we still leaving, Mummy?" She crouched down, pressing a kiss to his hair, unsure what to say. "Not yet," she whispered. But as she glanced at the note still resting on the counter, she felt a strange sense that "not yet" might mean more than just time. It might mean change. Something had shifted tonight, even if she couldn't name it. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, soft but growing. In Daniel's apartment, a light stayed on late, the glow illuminating his sketches and restless thoughts. Whatever plan was forming in his mind had begun to take shape, though even he wasn't sure what it would cost him. And as rain fell between their two homes, one truth hovered unseen. Trust had found two people too wounded to believe in it. Have you ever met someone whose silence said more than words ever could? Share your thoughts below in the comments. The knock on Emily's door came early, sharp enough to cut through the lingering quiet of morning. She froze mid-step, towel still in her hands, heart leaping to her throat. For a brief moment, she thought, perhaps hoped, it was Daniel, maybe there to ask about breakfast or the weather. But the second knock was harder, impatient. She knew that rhythm. It carried authority, not friendship. When she opened the door, Mr. Hayes stood there, expression carved from stone. His suit looked too perfect for this building, pressed, almost sterile, while his eyes scanned the hallway like a man checking for witnesses. "You've had plenty of notice, Ms. Carter," he said without preamble, his voice clipped, efficient. "I need the apartment vacated within 48 hours. He glanced at the boxes behind her, then at her son still in pajamas, curiosity in his tired eyes. Emily's throat tightened. 48 hours. 2 days. She tried to explain. She always tried. But he waved a dismissive hand before she could form the words. "It's policy, not personal," he said, "the kind of cruelty that pretends to be logic. There are rules, and you're past the limit." The tone hurt more than the words. It was the tone of someone who had decided she was already a failure, a problem being managed. He turned as if to leave, but Daniel had stepped into the hallway without realizing it. Daniel's posture was rigid, his face pale but alert. He didn't plan to be seen, but something in him forced movement forward. "Wait," he said, his voice thin but firm. Mr. Hayes stopped. Emily's eyes widened. Daniel never interfered, not like this. "She's trying," Daniel continued, his words halting between fear and determination. "She just needs time." The sentence hung awkwardly in the air, like a fragile bridge built too quickly. Mr. Hayes blinked, taken off guard more by who spoke than what was said. "And you are?" he asked, his tone dripping skepticism. Daniel hesitated, his fingers twisting against the notebook clutched in his hand. "Her neighbor," he said softly. The landlord smirked faintly. "Then maybe you should mind your own rent, neighbor." The word twisted with emphasis, deliberate humiliation. Emily watched Daniel's jaw tense, his breathing quicken, his eyes lower, not in defeat, but in restraint. The landlord adjusted his tie and turned back to Emily. 2 days, he repeated, by Friday morning, and then he was gone, his heavy footsteps echoing down the narrow hall until silence returned. Only this time, the silence was different. It wasn't peace. It was aftermath. Daniel remained standing in the same spot, grip tightening around his notebook until his knuckles turned white. "Daniel," Emily began, but her voice faltered. She wanted to thank him or apologize for what had just happened, but neither emotion fit right. "It's okay," he said quickly, cutting her off in his quiet way. "He doesn't like people like me either." It took her a second to understand what he meant, and when she did, her heart sank a little deeper. Daniel's tone wasn't angry. It was matter of fact, like weather he'd grown used to enduring. He turned as if to leave, but something stopped him mid-step. His shoulders twitched, and he muttered something under his breath, too low for her to catch. Emily frowned. "What did you say?" she asked. But Daniel just shook his head, already retreating toward his door. "Nothing," he replied softly, but the way his jaw clenched told her otherwise. Behind the closing door, his words replayed in his mind like a ticking clock he couldn't silence. Once he was inside, Daniel dropped his notebook onto the table and pressed both hands against it. His heart raced as if his body was trying to run while standing still. He hated confrontation, the unpredictability, the noise, the eyes. But what haunted him most wasn't the landlord's tone. It was the flash of something familiar in that man's face, like looking at a ghost from before the diagnosis, back when his mother's voice still echoed in their home. Emily leaned against the closed door, head resting against the frame, breath shaking. 2 days. The phrase replayed like a sentence. She looked at her son sitting quietly by the couch, small hands holding his toy car, pretending not to understand. But his eyes betrayed him. Children always know. Guilt burned in her skin. She wanted to cry, to scream, but exhaustion won. Instead, she whispered Daniel's name without realizing it, a prayer disguised as gratitude. Outside, rain began to fall again, slow and rhythmic. In his apartment, Daniel opened the notebook to a page from weeks ago, one filled with sketches of faces, some angry, some kind. He flipped to a blank sheet, pencil in hand, but he didn't draw right away. His hand hovered, trembling, as if waiting for permission from something unseen. Then the whisper he hadn't meant for Emily to hear echoed again in his mind, word for word. 4 short syllables he had never said aloud before. Not this time. Emily sat on the couch, watching the rain stream down the window pane in thin, glowing threads. Somewhere below, in the street, a car alarm went off, then quieted. But her attention stayed on the door across the hall. She didn't know that at that same moment, Daniel was tracing the outline of a plan inside his notebook. Not logical, not entirely safe, but driven by something stronger than fear. Something she hadn't yet seen in him. Defiance. And as thunder rolled once more above the city, both of them sat in their separate rooms, haunted by the same silent question neither dared to say aloud. What happens in 2 days, when kindness runs out? That night, the hallway between their apartments seemed quieter than ever before. Emily sat by the window long after her son had fallen asleep, the city's glow casting pale reflections across her face. Every creak, every gust of wind felt louder, sharper, like the building itself was listening to her fears. She couldn't stop hearing Daniel's voice from earlier, the way his tone cracked when he whispered something she couldn't understand. Those 4 words haunted her, even without meaning. When she stepped outside her apartment to throw away trash, she noticed it there, lying near the railing, Daniel's notebook. It must have fallen from his hands when he rushed inside earlier. She hesitated before picking it up. The cover was worn and soft at the edges, the pages full but neatly pressed together. It carried a faint scent of graphite and mint, the same as his tea. She turned it over in her hands, unsure if she should knock on his door or hold it until morning. But curiosity pulsed stronger than caution. Back inside, she sat at her table and flipped the notebook open. The first pages were filled with lines and patterns, rows of shapes interconnected like mind maps, small notes written in careful mathematical handwriting. But as she turned a few more pages, the structure dissolved into something different. Faces, buildings, emotion caught in graphite. She recognized her apartment door, her son playing on the porch, even herself sitting with tea in hand. Each drawing looked alive, tender, studied from a distance with unsettling attention. Her finger brushed across one particular drawing. Her building, drawn in grayscale, except for a bright rectangle of color penciled faintly above one door, the orange of the eviction notice. Beneath it, a soft scrawl in smaller letters. They can't take what love protects. The phrase made the back of her neck prickle. She glanced toward Daniel's door across the hall, lit faintly through the frosted window, and for a moment she wondered, was he planning something? Emily turned the page and found a second sketch, darker this time. The same notice, but this time on fire, embers rising from the paper like fall leaves. The detail was breathtaking and terrifying. Her eyes caught words written in the margins, half-finished sentences, fragments of thought. Silence isn't safety. Every structure falls differently. Not this time. The repetition of that last phrase made her heart pound faster. Part of her wanted to close the notebook then, to shut away whatever this was becoming. But she couldn't. The drawings pulled her deeper. Scenes of protesters, a city council building, a mother holding her child beneath storm clouds. Each image radiated urgency, as though Daniel's mind had been building a pressure he couldn't contain in words. She began to understand that his silence wasn't emptiness. It was direction, something coiling tighter inside him. She leaned back in the chair, palms pressing against the notebook cover. The weight of it felt heavier than paper. In its pages, Daniel had turned observation into mission, pain into design. There was no clear sign of danger, yet everything about the drawings vibrated with intent. Emily rose slowly, crossed the room, and set the book gently on his doorstep. Whatever this was, she didn't want to read another page without him knowing. The air in the hallway was cold, almost metallic. She lingered for a brief second, listening for sound from the other side. Nothing, not even the faint scratching of his pencil. She returned inside, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the couch, her heartbeat refusing to calm. It wasn't fear she felt exactly, but anticipation. Something had shifted between them again, something deeper and harder to name. In his apartment, Daniel stood in darkness, staring at the door. He knew immediately that something had been moved, his notebook. When he opened it and saw the smudged fingerprints along the edge of the pages, he didn't feel anger. He felt exposed. The sketches were private, his way of thinking, of remembering, but now they had become a message he hadn't meant to send yet. He closed it slowly and pressed the cover to his chest, eyes glinting under the dim light. He turned to the window, his reflection pale against the rain outside. In his head, an idea that had begun as guilt was now transforming, reshaping itself into resolve. The words he'd written, "They can't take what love protects," no longer felt poetic. They felt like instructions. His breathing steadied as though something inside him had clicked into alignment. The time for silence was ending, and though the thought terrified him, it also made him feel awake for the first time in years. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the faint glow under Daniel's door. Every few minutes, she saw shadows pass through the light. Slow, deliberate movements, like someone pacing and thinking. She wanted to knock, to ask what he meant, to test the growing connection between them. But something held her back. The fear of knowing. The fear that understanding might cost more than ignorance. The first traces of dawn began to creep over the horizon, turning the city pale gray. The eviction notice, still taped to her door, fluttered as if responding to some invisible wind inside the building. Emily stared at it, her pulse sinking to the flickering paper, and realized she didn't feel quite as powerless as before. Somewhere, something was beginning, though she couldn't see it yet. Not clearly. But Daniel could. The meeting at City Hall, Topic 06. The morning broke cold and gray, the kind of light that feels like judgment. Emily didn't expect the knock, though the sound was soft, almost hesitant. When she opened the door, Daniel stood there, clutching his notebook like a lifeline. His face looked different, focused but fragile, a quiet urgency behind his eyes. "Come with me," he said, voice low but firm. She blinked, confused. "Where?" "City Hall," he answered, with a steadiness that sounded borrowed from a braver version of himself. The words landed like a challenge neither of them had prepared for. Emily stared at him, uncertain whether to laugh or cry. "Daniel, that's not how this works," she whispered, glancing toward her sleeping son. "They don't care. They'll just tell me to leave." He didn't respond right away. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling. Then, softly, he said something that made her step closer. "I used to work there." The way he said it carried weight, a story pressed between syllables. Emily hesitated, sensing the memory was one that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. They walked down the cracked sidewalk toward the bus stop, water from last night's rain pooling in potholes. Daniel walked with intention, yet every movement looked measured, controlled. He didn't speak. Emily kept stealing glances at him, wondering what "used to" meant. The city around them was waking up, car horns, distant chatter, the sharp hiss of brakes. But it all felt muted beside the strangeness of this moment. She didn't know where they were going exactly. Only that Daniel needed her to come. For once, she didn't resist. In the bus, they sat side by side, the hum of the engine vibrating beneath their silence. Daniel's notebook rested on his lap, his thumb pressed against the edge of one page in a steady rhythm. maybe to calm himself. Emily noticed how his eyes never stayed still for long. They flicked from seat seams to reflections in the window, tracing unseen patterns. Every so often, he whispered sentences under his breath, incomplete thoughts that never quite reached her. She used to help them, she thought she heard, but she didn't ask who. When they stepped inside City Hall, the air changed. Everything was glass, metal, and polished tile, the kind of building that made ordinary people feel smaller. Emily's throat tightened. This was not her world. It belonged to others. Daniel, however, moved like a man revisiting old wounds. He paused once near the reception desk, eyes scanning the names displayed on sleek brass plates. His hands began to shake. Emily touched his sleeve gently. "We can leave," she whispered. He shook his head, barely whispering, "No, not yet." The receptionist, a woman with too bright lipstick and tired eyes, looked up as they approached. She blinked at Daniel, recognition flickering weakly. "You used to work here," she said, more statement than question. Daniel nodded, his lips barely moving. "Records. Before." The last word dissolved into air. For a moment something softened in the woman's face, like pity, but Daniel turned away before she could say anything more. "Meeting room at the end of the hall," she said, her voice low. "I'll tell them you're coming." The hallway seemed endless. Each step echoed too loudly against the marble floor, echoing off the glass panels. Daniel's breathing quickened. Twice, he stopped, fingers tapping the edge of his notebook like he was checking if it was still real. Emily sensed the battle happening inside him, a clash between memory and purpose. "You don't have to do this for me," she murmured. He stopped, turning toward her. "It's not just for you," he said. His eyes, for once, didn't flinch away. "It's for her, too." She didn't ask who her was. At the door, Daniel froze. His body stiffened, hands flexing as though preparing for impact. For a moment, Emily thought he might turn back, but then he exhaled slowly and pushed the door open. Inside, 4 officials sat around a table, mid-conversation. The faint scent of coffee and paper filled the room. Their chatter stopped instantly. Daniel's presence disrupted the space, not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. Silence has its own gravity when backed by conviction. One of the men, tall, gray-haired, and impatient, adjusted his tie. "Can we help you?" he asked sharply. Daniel's fingers twitched around his notebook before he replied. "You can listen." The official raised an eyebrow, dismissive already, but Daniel's voice had cut through the sterile calm like wind through dust. He stepped closer, his shoulders squared despite his trembling hands. Emily stayed near the door, watching, terrified but in awe. She had never seen him like this, anchored, determined, almost luminous in his fragility. He opened his notebook to a page already creased by use. "You evict people like her," he began. His words trembled at first, broken by pauses, but meaning carried stronger than precision. "You push them out. Rename compassion as paperwork. Destroy safety with rules. You call it policy. I call it silence." His grip on the notebook tightened as his tone deepened. The room shifted. Even the man in the suit stopped writing. Emily's eyes filled with tears, realizing each sentence came from wounds carved long before hers. Daniel flipped another page. The sound was small, but it echoed through every breath in that room. He lifted one drawing, a sketch of a woman standing before an eviction notice, holding her child. The lines were faint, but it carried pain and dignity in equal measure. "You see numbers," he said, holding it up for them. "I see stories you refuse to acknowledge, people's lives, my life." The officials avoided his gaze, shifting uneasily, caught between disbelief and discomfort. He continued quietly, This is what you erase when you stop listening." Emily wanted to speak, to step in, but she knew instinctively to stay still. This was his moment. She could feel the tremor of release in his body from across the room, like someone exhaling years of silence in a single breath. The officials exchanged guarded looks, waiting for someone to end it. But Daniel wasn't finished. "When you sign papers like hers," he said, voice rising slightly, "you're not just moving tenants, you're erasing voices, and I won't let you erase hers." One of the women at the table leaned forward, voice cautious. "Mr. Weaver, this isn't the proper forum." Daniel interrupted softly but firmly. "I know," he said. "I know what the proper forum is. I used to be part of it." He pointed toward the crest carved on the wall. "This building is supposed to serve people like her. It served my mother once. Until it didn't." His throat caught, but he didn't stop. Emily pressed her hands together, the truth beginning to unfold in fragments she couldn't yet piece together. The room fell so quiet that even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder. Daniel stood there, small, trembling, yet utterly unmovable. "You took everything from people like her before," he said finally, eyes glistening but steady. "Not again. Not this time." His words filled the room like the slow building of a storm, soaking into everyone who heard them. For the first time, the officials didn't look like authority figures. They looked like witnesses, uncertain of what they'd just felt. Emily stepped forward, her hand hovering near his shoulder but not touching. She noticed the damp stains of sweat on his sleeve, the faint tremor still lingering in his fingers. Daniel lowered his notebook slowly, his breathing shallow but steady. No one spoke. For a long moment, even time seemed reluctant to move. He had come full circle, back to the place where silence had once swallowed his mother's voice. Only now it was his turn to make sure the echo lasted. The silence inside the chamber pressed down on everyone like the weight of unshed rain. For a few seconds, Daniel looked as if he might crumble under it, his hands trembling, breath stuttering. But then something changed. His eyes focused, sharp and deliberate, no longer darting away. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a strange clarity, fragile yet unbreakable. It wasn't the uncertain tone of a man searching for words. It was the voice of someone remembering how to use them. "Her name is Emily Carter," he began, "and every line in your files reduces her to numbers. But there's a heartbeat behind those numbers." His words rippled through the room like cracks in a dam. The officials leaned forward slightly, drawn in despite themselves. Daniel's rhythm steadied with each sentence. Even his stammer seemed to vanish. "She works double shifts cleaning offices some of you walk through every day," he said. "She keeps every receipt, files every form, tries to live by the rules you say matter. And still, somehow, she's the one standing outside in the rain asking for more time while you sit here deciding if she deserves to stay warm." The tremor in his voice no longer came from fear. It came from rage too pure to disguise. Emily stood frozen near the back, her heart thudding painfully as the strangers in front of her shifted in discomfort. It felt surreal to hear her life narrated through someone else's courage. The details Daniel remembered, the compassion threaded through each word. It was as if he'd been watching from a place no one else could see. She wanted to interrupt, to tell him he didn't have to bear this for her. But even she couldn't move. Something about his truth felt larger than both of them, as though he were speaking for every unseen person between these walls. Daniel flipped open another page in his notebook, revealing a sketch of the eviction notice torn in half. "You call this paper fairness," he said, pointing to his drawing. "But I call it a weapon dressed as law. You tell people to follow the process, but the process was never built for them." His hands shook again, but not from weakness. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, and when he spoke next, his tone softened into something that pierced deeper. "Her son writes stories about heroes," he said quietly. "He doesn't know that his mother is one." A murmur ran through the officials. One of them, a woman in her 50s, cleared her throat and said something about proper protocol. But Daniel didn't stop this time. The more he spoke, the more the words seemed to find him, forming sentences he hadn't prepared but had carried for years inside his silence. "You always ask why people don't fight harder," he said, breath trembling. "It's because no one listens when they do. You punish the ones who try. My mother tried too." The last sentence landed heavy, leaving the air brittle and still. He took a step back from the table, eyes fixed somewhere between past and present. "She worked here," he said. "For you. in this very building, until she questioned an eviction policy. This eviction policy. She said it was cruel, that it took homes from people who only needed help. And do you know what happened to her? His throat tightened. The officials exchanged glances, realizing where this was heading, but it was too late. Daniel's next words came like the closing strike of a slow-building storm. "You fired her," Emily gasped, hand rising instinctively to her chest. But Daniel kept going. "You destroyed her because she cared too loudly," he said, voice breaking now. "You took her job, her home, her voice. And when she died, none of you remembered her name." His fingernails dug into the cover of his notebook. The pages quivered. Her name was Marie Weaver. And I was the boy watching her beg for mercy from people who never looked up from their papers. The tears he'd held back finally spilled, tracing paths down his still face. The officials sat in stunned silence. One man, the oldest among them, lowered his gaze. Papers rustled softly, small, guilty motions, as if the sound itself could shield him from the truth. The woman who had tried to interrupt bit her lip, her posture collapsing inward. The name Weaver echoed faintly, recognition spreading in whispers. They remembered the story. The employee dismissed for insubordination, a woman who challenged eviction laws. The details had faded from record, but not from conscience. Daniel's voice returned, quieter now, yet somehow stronger. "You think all this ended years ago, but it didn't. Every eviction, every form, every refusal, it's the same cruelty repeated in smaller echoes. My mother isn't here anymore, but she taught me something." He looked at Emily for the first time during his speech. That silence doesn't protect anyone. It only keeps the cruel comfortable. His words carried both tremor and finality. The kind that forces the human brain to go still, to reprocess everything it just heard. Emily's eyes blurred with tears, and she realized her hands were shaking. Something inside her broke open. Not from sadness, but from recognition. She could feel Daniel's mother in his words, woven into the pauses, the tremors, the courage that didn't need perfection to feel miraculous. For a man who rarely spoke, this moment wasn't just speech, it was resurrection. She watched his chest rise and fall, every breath carrying the last echoes of years spent too quiet. The officials exchanged slow glances, the room thick with tension and conscience. One leaned forward slightly and whispered, This is serious." But no one continued. No one asked him to leave. Daniel stood still, notebook open at that same drawing. The moment had turned sacred by accident, a testimony carved from heartbreak. And for the first time in years, no one looked at him with pity. They looked at him with understanding, maybe even shame. Minutes passed, unmeasured. Rain tapped faintly against the high windows, as if applauding softly for what couldn't be undone. Daniel lowered his head, finally letting his body release the tightness it had been holding since the day began. Emily walked toward him, slow and silent, standing just behind his shoulder. He didn't turn around, but the corner of his mouth trembled with something almost like relief. The faintest smile, not of pride but of release. When they finally left the chamber, the world outside felt too bright. Daniel clutched the notebook close, as if uncertain what to do with his hands now that they had done the unthinkable. Emily walked beside him, still processing the enormity of what she had just witnessed. A few reporters lingered near the entrance, unaware that something historic had just been born in the quiet of that small room. For Daniel, it wasn't victory. It was vindication. Delayed, incomplete, but real. He looked up at the gray sky, eyes blinking rapidly, trying to anchor himself after the storm of his own words. "It's strange," he murmured, almost to himself. "All my life, I couldn't speak, and when I finally did, it didn't feel like speaking. It felt like remembering." Emily didn't answer. She just placed her hand lightly on his arm, and for the first time, he didn't flinch from the gesture. They stood there together as the clouds began to part, neither knowing that what he revealed inside that chamber would soon ripple far beyond them both. The evening sky darkened slowly over the city, a fading bruise of color sinking into the horizon. Emily and Daniel walked side by side in silence, the air heavy with everything left unsaid. Each step echoed faintly off the wet pavement, folding their fatigue into the city's low hum. For hours, Daniel hadn't spoken another word, lost in a place far deeper than thought. Emily sensed it, the weight of something unresolved pressing against him. She didn't push. It wasn't silence she feared anymore. It was what might happen when it broke. When they reached the bench outside City Hall, Daniel sat first, dropping his notebook beside him as if it no longer belonged to him. Emily hesitated before joining him, glancing sideways at his face. He looked younger and older all at once, like someone stripped bare of everything except truth. The glow from the streetlight drew faint silver lines across his skin, revealing eyes still damp from earlier tears. After a long pause, he spoke quietly, like a man confessing to himself. "You know why I defended you, don't you?" The question hung in the air, dangerously fragile. Emily turned slowly to face him. Her voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. "Because of your mother." Daniel nodded without looking up. The acknowledgement alone seemed to drain something out of him, like releasing pressure that had built for too long. She wanted to say something comforting, to thank him again. But none of the words she rehearsed felt right. Comfort was too small a thing for what he had given her. And forgiveness. She wasn't sure who needed it more. He reached for the notebook, opening it to a page Emily hadn't seen. It showed two drawings, one of a woman holding a protest sign, and another of a small boy watching her from behind a window. "That's us," he whispered. "Her and me. The day before. Before they ruined everything." His hand hovered over the page as though tracing ghosts. Emily's heart ached as she saw the resemblance, the gentle slope of the woman's face, the same defiant tilt that lived now in Daniel's eyes. This wasn't only a memory. It was an inheritance of pain, shaped into purpose. She believed in helping people who couldn't help themselves, Daniel said, voice rough from exhaustion. But when she refused to process the evictions, they turned on her, said she was emotional, said she was unstable. He laughed under his breath, short, disbelieving. "Funny word, isn't it? Unstable. It's what they call you when your kindness makes them uncomfortable." His fingers brushed the edges of the paper until a corner tore slightly. Even then, he didn't stop. "She died thinking she failed, but I remember everything she said. Every word." Emily watched quietly, her throat tightening. There was something sacred about how he spoke his mother's story. Not for sympathy, but for reconstruction, like rebuilding ruins in memory's landscape. "When they fired her," Daniel continued, "the same man who signed the papers was sitting in that room today." His voice trembled, then sharpened. "The landlord, Hayes, used to oversee those evictions. He signed her dismissal too." Emily froze. The realization hit like a pulse of cold through her chest. The man who had threatened her home was the same man who had destroyed Daniel's mother. She leaned forward, her voice quivering. "You mean, he knew?" Daniel nodded, his expression hollow but certain. "Of course he knew. He always knows." He pressed his palms together, whispering, "It isn't coincidence. It's repetition." The air between them thickened with the unbearable truth of it. This wasn't just Emily's story anymore. It was the continuation of another one silenced years ago. "When he came to your door," Daniel said softly. "It was like watching history try to repeat itself. I couldn't let that happen again." Emily found herself staring at him, seeing not just the gentle neighbor next door, but a man standing in the aftermath of two histories, his mother's and hers, woven together by injustice. "You carried that alone all these years?" she asked. Daniel's eyes flicked toward her, the ghost of a wry smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "I carry everything alone," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, "But not anymore, maybe." The confession felt like a fragile pact, sealed not with promises but shared fatigue. The minutes stretched as the city lights blinked awake one by one. Cars passed, indifferent, their headlights slicing through rain that hadn't stopped since morning. Emily thought of all the times she'd walked past him without really seeing him. All the time, silence had felt like distance, when it had been the only language of safety he knew. Now, sitting beside him, that same silence felt like understanding. Two separate griefs learning how to share the same air. Daniel rubbed his temples, exhaustion finally catching up to him. I kept thinking if I stayed quiet, I could protect myself, he said. But silence becomes a cage after a while. You forget where the door is. He looked up, eyes reflecting the faint lamplight. Today I opened it. For her. For you. Maybe for me. Emily reached over, placing a hesitant hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. The rain softened into mist, wrapping them in its quiet. Nothing heroic happened in that moment, and yet everything did. Somewhere inside City Hall, lights flickered off one by one, leaving the building swallowed in silver shadow. Daniel glanced at it one last time, his expression unreadable. You threw my mother away, he whispered, almost unconsciously, echoing the words he'd spoken hours earlier in front of the officials. But not this time. The repetition carried no anger now, only release. It was the sound of a man finally laying a ghost to rest. Emily stood as the first hint of dawn began to stain the horizon. Her eyes followed the light breaking over rooftops, faint but steady. She looked back at him, at the weary curve of his shoulders, the notebook still balanced on his knees. You did it, she said softly. You made them listen. Daniel didn't respond. He just watched the sky, expression caught somewhere between sorrow and peace. Maybe they'll remember, he finally said. That's all I wanted. As the morning wind stirred, a single page slipped loose from his notebook, fluttering toward the wet pavement. Emily bent down to pick it up, but Daniel shook his head gently. Let it go, he said, eyes following the page as it spiraled away into the gray light. She understood. Some truths, once released, no longer belonged to anyone. They simply drifted, reminding, haunting, changing everything they touched. Neither of them moved for a long time. They sat there in the thinning rain, two quiet survivors of stories that had once been treated as noise. And though neither spoke again, something invisible passed between them, a promise unspoken, the kind born not of hope, but of endurance. And somewhere in the distance, the city kept breathing, unaware that history had quietly been rewritten by two people who refused to remain unseen. By the time the story broke across the city, it no longer belonged just to them. Local papers called it the Quiet Revolution, while television anchors spoke of a former clerk-turned-activist who had stood before the council and told the truth the city had spent years avoiding. Emily first heard about it from a neighbor, Mrs. Walker, the same woman who once whispered behind closed doors. She appeared at Emily's door holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, pretending this was a friendly routine and not contrition wrapped in small talk. Was that your neighbor? The one who spoke? She asked softly, as if afraid her voice might break the fragile new tenderness in the building. Emily nodded, trying to smile, though her throat ached with disbelief. For so long, kindness had been currency she couldn't afford. The next morning, Emily woke to a pale, trembling light leaking through the blinds. Her son was still asleep, his small hand curled around the edge of a blanket that had once been Daniel's gift. A quiet gesture clumsy in its sincerity. She moved toward the kitchen, coffee cooling untouched as she read the message glowing on her phone screen. The city council had announced an emergency investigation into the local eviction policies. Her name, Emily Carter, appeared in the document as a pending review. Her first instinct was disbelief, her second, gratitude. 2 days ago, she had been invisible. Now her story was being read aloud in rooms where her existence had never mattered. The letter arrived that afternoon. It was official, stamped with the city seal and signed by an unfamiliar hand. Eviction suspended pending full review, it read. Nothing more. Nothing less. She read it once, twice, 3 times, her eyes scanning the dry legal wording that couldn't possibly capture the miracle it represented. Then she slid down the wall, clutching the paper to her chest, laughter and tears colliding until she couldn't tell one from the other. Her son rushed to her side, confused but smiling. "Mommy?" he asked softly. She wrapped her arms around him, breathing in the moment. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a visitor in her own home. Meanwhile, across the hall, Daniel sat with the television off and his window open to the cool air. He had seen the news headlines too. His name appeared everywhere. Photos at the council hearing, captions that called him the man who spoke truth to silence. He turned away from the screen each time, uncomfortable in the glare of something he hadn't sought. What mattered to him wasn't the attention. It was the stillness afterward, the strange quiet that no longer carried shame. When the knock came at his door, he already knew who it was. Emily stood there, her eyes wet but shining, a folded letter trembling in her hand. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she held out the letter toward him, letting the weight of it speak for itself. "They stopped it," she whispered finally, her voice breaking like thin ice. "They're letting us stay." For a moment, Daniel just stared at it, the paper that had rewritten both their stories. A single breath escaped him, slow and deliberate, before a faint, genuine smile touched his face. It wasn't triumph exactly, but something gentler. "Good," he said. Then quieter. "That's good." The words felt insufficient for all they carried. Emily wanted to hug him, but she didn't. Sometimes gratitude was best left uncontained. Over the following days, the same neighbors who had once avoided her began showing up unannounced. One brought groceries, another dropped off spare boxes, just in case she still needed them. Words like help and sorry floated through the air in ways that felt awkward at first, but sincere. A local reporter even knocked, asking nervously if she might share her story for a human interest segment. Emily politely refused. Her story, she decided, had already been told, by someone who had risked his voice to give it meaning. In the evenings, children played again in the hallway, laughter echoing where whispers used to live. Daniel watched it all unfold from his quiet corner. The world seemed louder now, but not in the same painful way. He no longer flinched at footsteps or muffled conversations. Instead, he listened with cautious curiosity, as if rediscovering an old language. When Emily invited him for dinner, his instinct was to refuse. He wasn't sure he knew how to belong in a shared space anymore. But then her son appeared behind her, grinning widely, saying, "You have to come, Mr. Daniel." And somehow, that was enough. He agreed, though the idea of eating at someone else's table made his hands tremble all afternoon. That night her kitchen smelled like rosemary and rain. Emily had only managed a simple meal, potatoes, rice, and stew, but she treated each detail like sacred ritual. The table was small, crowded with warmth rather than dishes. Daniel sat stiffly at first, but her son's chatter soon filled every pause. When he began imitating Daniel's speech at City Hall, waving his hands dramatically, Daniel laughed for the first time, an unfamiliar, honest sound. "You were brave," Emily said softly once the plates were cleared. He shook his head slowly, eyes low but peaceful. "You were brave first," he said. "I just learned from you." The story didn't end that night. Reporters still lingered outside for several days, their camera lights flickering like restless fireflies. They called the event the Turning Point Hearing. Commentators on morning shows argued whether it symbolized a moral shift or just temporary empathy. But for Emily and Daniel, the noise faded quickly into something quieter, life resuming its small routines. She returned to work, walking the same path through the city that had once made her feel invisible. Now, strangers smiled faintly in recognition. She didn't need to smile back every time. The meaning was already enough. One afternoon, as Emily sorted bills on her kitchen table, a knock echoed at her door, the deliberate rhythm she would never forget. Mr. Hayes stood there, posture unusually rigid, eyes downcast. His face looked older somehow, the polished arrogance replaced by unease. "The council overturned the eviction," he said quietly. "They ordered a review of past cases, too." Then, after a long pause, he added, almost to himself, "I'm sorry for how I handled this." Emily stared at him, uncertain what to feel. Anger seemed useless now. Instead, she nodded once. "Thank you," she said, and closed the door before her dignity could falter. From his apartment across the hall, Daniel had been standing by the window the entire time. He saw Hayes leave with slow, uncertain steps. The sight stirred something inside him, a soft ache that wasn't resentment anymore but closure. After years of replaying old memories of cruelty and loss, he finally saw consequence, small but real. The man who once signed eviction notices now walked away humbled, his shadow smaller than the echo of his guilt. Daniel breathed deeply, feeling the air expand easily in his chest for the first time in memory. The pattern had been broken. Not erased, but broken. That evening, Emily knocked on Daniel's door one more time. This time she carried a small canvas she and her son had painted together. A bright blue building with 2 windows, light glowing from both. "It's us," she said. He smiled at the colors bleeding through one another, imperfect but alive. Behind him, on his desk, another drawing waited. His building again, this time kissed by sunlight rather than soaked in rain. "You're still painting it," she noticed. Daniel nodded. "Because for once," he said tenderly, "the light feels like it belongs there." Days later, normal life reassembled itself gently. The hallway filled again with mail and neighborly chatter. Yet something intangible had changed, a shared pulse of awareness, a quiet current of empathy moving beneath the monotony. Emily often left her door cracked open now, not out of carelessness, but symbolic invitation. And sometimes, late at night, Daniel heard faint music from her apartment, a soft tune, possibly a lullaby. The sound no longer startled him. It soothed him, the way silence used to. It meant survival was no longer something they did apart. In one of his final drawings before midnight, Daniel sketched the view from his window. The same parking lot, the same trees, the same world. But this time, there were figures standing beneath streetlights, outlines of people he cared about. At the center was Emily holding her son's hand, both gazing upward toward something they couldn't quite see. Above them, faint lines of color merged into sunrise, unfinished, uncontained. He stared at it for a long time, thinking of his mother, of Emily, of all the lives quiet people had kept alive by simply refusing to disappear. That night, as he prepared for bed, Daniel whispered something into the dark. It wasn't prayer exactly, but gratitude shaped like one. "You finished what I started," he imagined his mother's voice saying in return. And maybe, in some way, she had. Outside, the rain began again. Soft, rhythmic, unthreatening this time. He listened without fear, the way one listens to a familiar memory turned gentle. Across the hall, light still glowed faintly under Emily's door, proof that some stories, once saved, refused to end. Days passed, and the city began to move on. But for Emily and Daniel, time didn't feel quite the same anymore. What had happened at City Hall didn't vanish like most stories do. It stayed, hovering in the air between them. Emily noticed it in small things. The way neighbors greeted her now, softer, as if measuring their words. The way Daniel seemed lighter, though his silences carried more meaning than ever. The world had changed shape around them, gently, but undeniably. It wasn't loud change. It was like the quiet of dawn after a storm, when everything smells like renewal, but still trembles from what it survived. One afternoon, Emily stopped by Daniel's apartment carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop down the street. She hesitated before knocking, unsure if she was interrupting his solitude, but when he opened the door, she saw a faint smile form instantly, a warmth that told her she was welcome without question. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paint and tea. Sunlight poured through the blinds, landing on an open notebook on his table. "Still drawing?" she asked, placing the cups down. He nodded, flipping one page forward to reveal an almost finished sketch. A street corner flooded with early light, the same building they lived in, but transformed by color. She leaned closer, studying the details. "It looks different," she said softly. Daniel paused, looking at the drawing as though he were seeing it for the first time himself. "Because now, it is," he replied. There was no pride in his voice, just quiet recognition. Emily ran a finger gently across the edge of the page, careful not to smudge the ink, noticing how he'd even drawn the faint outline of her window, curtains half open. "You've been watching again," she said, teasing lightly. Daniel smiled at that, small but real, and shrugged. "Artists notice," he said. "That's all." For a moment, laughter brushed through the air like fragile glass catching sunlight. They sat by the window as they often did now, watching pedestrians and rain clouds play their quiet, endless rhythm below. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. Sometimes, connection doesn't live in what is said, but in the pauses that choose to linger between words. Emily thought about everything that had brought them here. The fear, the eviction, the moment his voice broke through silence, and realized how deeply intertwined their lives had become. The line between savior and saved had blurred completely. They had rescued each other in different ways, neither realizing when it had started. Outside, faint music drifted from a neighboring apartment, an old jazz tune, cracked and warm, bouncing against the walls. Daniel tilted his head toward the sound, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on his knee. "She used to play that," he murmured. Emily turned to him. "Your mother?" He nodded, his voice faint. "On weekends, when she cleaned. Said it made the work feel less like work. I didn't understand it then. Now I think she was teaching me how to survive days that refused to be soft." Emily looked at him, silence swelling gently between them, and for one moment, she felt the world stop spinning. Later that evening, as shadows grew long, Emily found herself staring at Daniel's notebook again. This time it was closed, a blank page resting on top as if waiting for the next chapter. "What will you draw next?" she asked quietly. Daniel followed her gaze, his thumb sliding over the edge of the cover. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe something that hasn't happened." The answer made her smile. There was something beautiful about that uncertainty, about the idea that he no longer needed to plan his every step, that he could allow life to surprise him again. The room grew dim. The last threads of daylight folded into soft gold across the table. Emily stood to leave, but hesitated near the door. "Daniel," she said, voice low. "You changed everything." He shook his head slowly, his eyes glinting with the gentlest defiance. "You did," he said. "Because you listened." The exchange was simple, but it hit her deeper than any grand declaration could. Two people who had once lived like ghosts now stood in full light, acknowledged, seen. The power in that moment wasn't volume. It was presence, as real and steady as breath. For a while, neither of them moved. The silence that settled around them didn't need filling. It pulsed softly, alive with understanding. Through the open window, the smell of rain mixed with city dust and blooming trees. Emily closed her eyes briefly, committing the moment to memory. The sound of the street, the faint hum of neighbors' chatter, the quiet certainty that life was finally standing still after so much trembling. Daniel sat unmoving, the corners of his mouth lifted, his gaze lost to the horizon, as if reading a story spelled in fading light. Eventually, Emily reached for the doorknob, but paused once more, something pulling her back. "Will you ever speak like that again?" she asked gently, referring to his voice at City Hall. Daniel didn't answer right away. He thought for a while, then exhaled. "Only if I need to," he said finally. "Words feel heavier once they've been used right." She nodded, understanding perfectly. Some voices aren't meant to be loud every day. They exist so that, when they rise, the world remembers to listen. Long after she left, Daniel remained at the window, his notebook still open to the blank page. The street below glimmered in patches of lamplight, the rain turning puddles into miniature mirrors. He dipped his pencil lightly against the paper, drawing not a building or face this time, but a horizon, stretching infinitely. He left the middle blank, wide and waiting. For once, he didn't need to fill the emptiness. It was enough to know that it existed. That possibility was its own kind of peace. In her apartment, Emily tucked her son into bed, his tiny hands still holding the toy car he refused to let go of. She sat beside him, brushing hair from his forehead, realizing that the walls no longer felt thin or temporary. They were steady, safe, a home. Her gaze wandered to the small note Daniel had once slid under her door, the same faded paper pinned now beside her lamp. "You're not alone." The ink had begun to lighten, but its meaning never had. That sentence had become the quiet motion of her days, the hum behind every breath. Outside, the night exhaled. Daniel finally closed the notebook, resting his hand on its cover, like one might rest a hand over a heartbeat. Through the window, he could see the faint glow of Emily's lamp across the hall. 2 windows lit on the same floor, proof of connection, endurance, and renewed belonging. The city beyond them pulsed as always, loud and indifferent, but in that small corner of it, something sacred lingered. Not a speech, not an image, just the echo of words spoken at the right moment, by the right voice. The world would forget in time, of course it would. Headlines fade, attention shifts. But for Emily, for Daniel, for the few who had listened closely enough to understand, the echo would remain. In every quiet act of defiance, in every whisper offered where words once failed, their story continued. He had spoken not to change the world, but to remind it of its heartbeat, and now that rhythm lived in both of them. They didn't need applause, nor witnesses. Just the soft knowledge that survival itself can sound like forgiveness, and that sometimes all history needs to begin again is one trembling voice that finally refuses to stay silent. Before you go, if this story touched something inside you, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or one step away from losing everything, then take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share in the comments what part of Emily and Daniel's story meant the most to you. So many people out there are still fighting quiet battles like theirs, trying to find a voice in a world that doesn't always listen. Your comment might be the words someone needs to read tonight to believe that kindness, empathy, and courage can still change everything. Because sometimes, a simple story reminds us all that no one deserves to face silence alone.